I'm the program director with the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance, and it is such an honor to be here today with all of you at the 2015 Summit on Race and Inclusion, so welcome. First things first, coffee will be after the morning plenary session. You will move to your breakouts and there will be coffee and refreshments. I'm sure that was something many of you were wondering about. I know myself included. I need to know when I'm going to have my coffee, so please know after our morning plenary session we will have that. Before we begin, I'd like to extend heartfelt thanks to all of those who made this day possible. Thank you to our sponsors and our funders, without whom we would not be able to be here today. All of our funders are listed in your packet. You have a page of funders and collaborating organizations who have contributed and helped market and help recruit such a wonderful large crowd. We have almost a full house. We have 720 people here today. So that's really, really exciting. So round of applause. Thank you to all of our volunteers. Thank you to Grand Haven Area Public Schools. Thank you to Tracy Wilson, the Grand Haven High School principal, who was working so diligently to make all of the details. It was such a pleasure to work with her. Thank you, Tracy. To the Diversity Alliance. Oh, round of applause. Sorry. Thanks, Tracy. To the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance staff. I know all of you have also worked really hard and work hard throughout the year to promote racial equity and to promote inclusion. So thank you, staff. It's such an honor to work with such a great team of people. Round of applause for the Diversity Alliance staff. And thank you to all of our speakers. We know that all of you are such busy people and doing all of this national level touring and talking and really promoting racial equity nationally. And it's such an honor to have our amazing lineup of speakers with us here today. So thank you to all of our speakers. A special thank you to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation for infusing our work with the resources necessary to expand our capacity and for building a community of partners dedicated to addressing the needs of children, families, and communities through a racial equity lens. So thank you to the Kellogg Foundation. And finally, thank you to all of you who have joined us here today, who have taken time out of your busy schedules to come together for a moment of really information and inspiration in promoting the work of racial equity. So thank you to all of you. Before we begin, I would like to say that in your packet you will notice our hashtag Beyond Bias. So Grand Haven Area Public Schools has opened up the Wi-Fi here for your use today. I think it's GHAPS Open. So we would encourage you to participate here and through social media. We'll be live tweeting throughout the day, so hashtag Beyond Bias. And with that, we will begin. I would like to welcome to the stage Keith Konarska, Superintendent of Grand Haven Area Public Schools, and Shaylee Menon, the Associate Dean for Professional Development and Administration with Grand Valley State University. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
It is so exciting to see each and every one of you out there. It means so much to our organization, our school district, and certainly our community. I'm Keith Konarska. I'm the superintendent of the Grand Haven Area Public Schools and also the co-chair for the Diversity Initiative for Northwest Ottawa County. On behalf of our Board of Education, all of our staff, I'd like to welcome all of you again to the 2015 Summit on Race and Inclusion. Again, something very important to our school district and to our community. I am here today honored to host all of you and welcome the expertise of the nation's top experts to guide us in our efforts. This day is so important, as I said, to our school district and greater community because it is yet another step toward creating the kind of culture that we all desire, being a community that is welcoming to all. This is not a goal that we take lightly, and we still have a lot of work to do yet. I am impressed by seeing all of you here today. It means so much, which just reaffirms that race and inclusion is a significant focus for many of us. And yes, your presence here affirms that we are all in this together. Celebration from all facets of our community, whether it is business, nonprofits, healthcare, faith-based organization school district can only strengthen our efforts as we work towards that common goal. Our community is truly blessed to host this event today. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Thanks for being here.
It is my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the community. It's so wonderful to see all your smiling faces on such a cold morning. We are honored that the Summit on Race and Equity has come to Grand Haven this year after having started in Holland in 2001. Keith and I, as he mentioned, are two of the 4 co-chairs of the Diversity Initiative of Northwest Ottawa County. This initiative works to promote racial equity and the active inclusion of people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds who work, live, and play in Northwest Ottawa County. One of the aims of our initiative is to address issues of implicit bias and institutional barriers to racial inclusion and equity. By doing this, we will increase employment opportunities for people of color, create more supportive working and living environments for everyone, and make our community a more welcoming and vibrant place to live and work. During last year's summit, we heard thought-provoking and insightful talks and panel discussions about implicit and unintentional biases. This year, we have lined up brilliant speakers who will talk about interventions to overcome these biases and maximize opportunities to promote equality and equity. This summit is part of an important ongoing conversation that will allow us to lean into our discomfort and address issues which are of vital importance to our local community and beyond. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. I also have the pleasure of introducing a video from Governor Snyder. The governor is very supportive of this work and recognizes its importance to our communities and to our state.
Well, good morning, everyone. And again, on behalf of the committee, thank you for showing up on this balmy spring day. We're really excited to have you here at the Grand Haven High School. It's exciting to see so many people take an interest in this vital initiative. As background, again, my name is Nelson Jacobson. I have the privilege of serving as the chairman and CEO of JSJ Corporation. We're a Grand Haven-based company. We're in our 96th year. We're a family business made up of the Jacobson, Johnson, and Sherwood families. And we have over 2,500 employees operating businesses throughout the world. And that gives us a unique context and understanding for the important topic that we're talking about today. We have the privilege and honor of working with people in all different environments throughout the globe on a daily basis. And we see the power and the inspiration and the innovation that comes through that collaboration of working across cultures and across different areas and different contexts. On a more personal basis, my family, again, has been here nearly 100 years. My father and his siblings graduated from Grand Haven High School, but it was located where Central School is today. As the community developed, things changed, and myself, my wife, my siblings, my wife's siblings graduated from Grand Haven High School, but it's located where Lakeshore Middle School is today. We have 3 boys, lots of cousins and all that have graduated from Grand Haven High School out of this facility. So over that time, Grand Haven has evolved just as Ottawa County has evolved, just as West Michigan has evolved. And I think that's an interesting context for us to think about. To continue to evolve, to continue to be relevant, we need to learn and take personal responsibility for how can we be inclusive and engaging and supportive of those who are here, but equally important is those who will come. We're all very proud of our community. That's why you're here. And there's many people who couldn't be here today that have called me and said, I wish I was here. I'm excited to hear about it. We want to be better. And that's what today's about. And our keynote speaker is going to start with some very thought-provoking and challenging ideas about how the mind works and how each of us can learn ways that we can be better and more inclusive with each other in our daily lives. So let me introduce Rachel Godsil, our keynote speaker. Rachel is the Director of Research at the Perception Institute, a national consortium focusing on the implications of the mind, sciences of policy, culture, and institution. Godsil is also the Eleanor Bontaschow Professor of Law at Seton Hall University Law School. The former Assistant U.S. Attorney, Godsil's research focuses on applying insights from the mind sciences to race, law, and public policy. She is the author of numerous articles and books, chapters on implications or implicit biases in race, including the recent publication, The Science of Equality, Volume 1, Addressing Implicit Bias, Racial Anxiety, and Stereotype Threat in Education and Healthcare. With that, let me introduce Rachel and have her come up and start teaching us to be a better, embracing, collaborative community.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how absolutely thrilling it is to be standing here on this gorgeous stage and looking out at this vast audience. My daughters who are in high school would be extraordinarily jealous to see this stunning facility, and honored to come back to Michigan, where I went to law school and where I began my legal career. Some of you might be wondering, why is this lawyer person up here talking about the mind sciences? What does she know, and why is she doing this? And the answer is, I come from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, another city on the lake, which I'm very proud. But during my childhood, the racial segregation in Milwaukee was something that was deeply rooted and confusing to a child. Because as a child, my parents raised me to believe, as I believe that virtually everyone here was raised to believe, that we're all equal, and that's what our country's about. And I heard stories of lawyers who played a role in the effort to make our country live up to its ideals. And so I went to law school with that goal in mind. And I thought law school was going to be, I was the first person in my family to go to law school. I thought it was going to be this really boring, challenging 3 years where I would memorize a lot of laws, and then I would get to go out and do something exciting. Well, Michigan Law School, and I know there's a lot of Michigan State people here, and some of my best friends are from Michigan State, so I don't want to create any tensions. But law school was a place that was vibrant and it was exciting, and I went into practice and was really fortunate to be able to work on the issues that I cared about. But there still was a great deal that I didn't understand, and that many who were in civil rights law didn't understand. And what we didn't understand was what I described. The country had moved so far in our values. We'd moved so far in our ideals and our recognition of the importance of equality, our rejection of racism, and yet we weren't seeing the progress that we thought we'd see. And so what the mind sciences have done is they've given us the beginning of unlocking some of what's so confusing. Now, it is amazing to see the leadership, the commitment, the vision that the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance has, that's indicated by the presence of such a wide variety of people from different parts of the community who are here on a Friday morning listening to this topic and ready to spend the day grappling with the complex issues of race. And when I saw the sort of the structure of the work that LEADA's doing, it's really inspiring. And it does point to the need for leadership, for community, but there's also represented on that structural vision the role of people. And so we need our structures to move, but we all need to be part of that movement for the institutions and the structures to fulfill the promise of a vision like this. And this is what the mind sciences can begin to help us do. So because we're in a school, and because the issue of educational equity is, I'm sure, sort of near and dear to all of our hearts, there are educators here, there are parents here, there are grandparents here, and again, I think the country is virtually united in the notion that there should be educational opportunity that allows every child in this country to thrive. We know teachers go into education with the goal of teaching children and the goal of providing that opportunity and unlocking the creativity and the potential that every child goes to school with. And yet we also know that when we look at data, and this is national data, we're not seeing what we think we ought to see, given the commitment, given the devotion, given the time and the energy and the love that teachers are putting into the schools. We're still seeing outcomes that are surprising and extraordinarily distressing. So what I'm showing you here is a graph depicting the increase in suspension rates from 1972 to 2009 and 10 on a national level. Now, I don't know how many of you were in school in 1972. I was. Those were not halcyon days. I don't know that any of us would look back to 1972 and say, wow, I wish we could get back to 1972, right? I mean, again, maybe someone here, and I don't mean to sort of undercut your vision, but if we think of 1972, we wouldn't think that we would look back with a little bit of sort of astonishment that we're not better off than we were in 1972 when it comes to race and ethnicity. With respect to some things, like suspension, we're worse off. What can explain that? We absolutely know, and I know there are many teachers here, we know that teachers want to be fair. I spend a lot of my time talking to judges, and I know the judges I talk to want to be objective, they want to be fair. The idea that race or ethnicity or any factor would affect the decisions they make about sentencing, the decision they make about whether to remove a child from a home, the idea that race would enter into that equation is utterly anathema to the very essence of their being. And I know teachers feel that way too. And yet, when we look and ask the question, so what is explaining these suspension rates? Is it that children of some groups are just behaving more badly? Is that what's happening? The evidence suggests otherwise. The explanation for those drastic disproportionalities in who's suspended aren't because some kids are fighting more. The most typical justification for the suspensions of African American boys is disrespect and loitering. Disrespect and loitering. That's a subjective term. To send a child home because he's spending a little too much time in the hallway, I don't think so. But again, I also don't think that the teachers are thinking, so there's no animus in their mind when that decision's made. Something else is going on. We also know, when we talk about as a country, why do we not see educational progress to the extent that we'd expect for every racial and ethnic group? Why don't we see that? There's powerful evidence to suggest that there's a phenomenon called stereotype threat, which is the concern that we sometimes feel when we're engaged in a really difficult enterprise, like taking a standardized test, that we might confirm a negative stereotype about our group. And that's something that begins when the standardized tests begin in elementary school, and it persists through college. And from K to 12, some Stanford social psychologists have estimated that it accounts, broadly speaking, for about 62 points on the SAT scores when you compare black high school graduates to white high school graduates. Stereotype threat is an illustration of capacity not being recognized, potential being underestimated. And that means all of us are not benefiting, particularly the students, but our whole community, our whole country are not benefiting from the talents of all of our young people equally. And we know that's something we need to change. Another phenomena that is extremely surprising to many, because sometimes we think, all right, and we've heard this term implicit or unintended bias. Our FBI director, Jim Comey, talked about this phenomena in policing. So we're beginning to become familiar with that term. So often we think, all right, what we have to look at is how to help people not engage in this unintended implicit bias. But it turns out bias alone won't do all the work, or doesn't do all the work that we think it does. Another phenomena we have to be aware of is sometimes whites so desperately want to be non-racist and to show that we're non-racist that we do harm by not giving critical feedback we need to give. So I'm going to tell you about a study where intentionally badly written middle school essays were sent around to middle school teachers, and the teachers said, please respond and give feedback to the students, and they were given pictures of the students so they knew the race. And this study found that teachers were giving less critical feedback to Black and Latino students than they were giving to white students. Less critical feedback, over praise. But there was one exception. Teachers who were in schools where they felt the support and the backing of their principals and their communities were giving equal feedback to Black and white students. They were still giving less critical feedback to Latino students. And what that tells us is we have two different phenomena going on. We have to address both, but we have to disentangle what's happening. With respect to the Latino students, the suggestion is there's some implicit bias going on. There's some perhaps unrecognized assumptions about the capacity to write an essay. And we need to grapple with that, and we need to help the teachers, sort of work past that. But with respect to the Black students, something different is going on. With those students, if the teachers feel like their principal supports them, they're giving equal feedback, suggesting it's the fear of being considered racist that's preventing the teachers from being the teacher they want to be and give the students the feedback that they need. So we need to understand the complexity of how kind of the different components of how race plays out in our minds work in order to come up with interventions, in order for us all to sort of alter our behavior and live the values that we have. So it's a complicated conversation, but what's exciting is there's a lot of work being done that can help us do that. So we know that there still is explicit bias. We know that there are incidents that occur by individuals who continue to hold animus based upon race, based upon ethnicity, based upon religion. We know that continues to exist. We know that there continue to be in place the historical manifestations of a very long period in which people were treated differently. So my grandfather didn't graduate from high school. He finished school in 8th grade. And my grandmother didn't graduate from high school. She finished school in 6th grade. She cleaned houses. He was a tool and die maker. All three of their kids went to college. How did that happen? Well, a big reason that happened is because my grandparents were able to get a loan that was guaranteed by the federal government. So working class Irish Catholics in St. Louis were able to purchase a small home. And from that small home, they were able to have the resources to help their kids graduate from college. Why am I telling you this story? Because if they had been Black, they would not have been eligible in 1952 to receive that government-guaranteed loan. Wouldn't have been eligible. So my family's trajectory from, again, tool and die makers do important work, and I think we all have to value people who are making things, but their aspirations were for their kids to go to college, and the federal government helped make it so. But it didn't help make it so equally. And we're still living now with the sort of the familial trajectories that our families lived through, partly based upon race. So those structures still exist. But what I want to talk about today, what I want us to work and grapple with together today, is not what's happened because of history, but what's happening today. What we can all be responsible to come together to change in our behavior and in the way we interact with each other today. So I'm not going to talk too much about explicit bias because, frankly, you're here. You're here. That's not your issue. I'm going to talk about implicit bias. I'm going to talk about this anxiety that we sometimes have around race when we're engaged in interracial interactions, that the anxiety itself can make it hard for us to move forward together. And I'm going to talk about stereotype threat that we need to address to unleash the full potential of every member of our community. But before I do all that, we have to take a second, and I'm going to ask for full group participation. And I think this is the biggest group I've ever talked in front of. 500 was the biggest before. So this is going to be awesome. Because everyone, thank you. Okay, I need the enthusiasm. I know it's early, haven't had enough coffee yet, but I'm going to ask everyone together to please state the color of the text. Now we'll do one practice round. Ready? All together, out loud. Ready? Okay, we're going to be a little louder than that. Ready? We're going to try again. All right. We were fabulous. As a group, we were fabulous. Blue, red, green, black, green. It was all together. It was, I felt like we were at a football game. It was awesome. We knew the chant. But when we got to the black text that said the letter red, we all fell apart. Because we all did what our teachers have taught us to do since in my day, maybe first or second grade, now, pre-K, preschool. We read the text. Our automatic brains overcame our executive function. Everyone was with me. I saw it. He did a charge. I was all excited. So I know you were all with me, and we were together doing what I asked you to do. But our automatic brains, the automaticity of our unconscious processes are really powerful, and we get to experience that as a group. And what I'll tell you, this is called the Stroop test, and this is not just a parlor trick. This is a critical psychological tool to understand our implicit mind. And so this is really the beginning of our journey, and so I hope it was fun. Now, another exercise. And this time, there's actually a really excellent English accent, so I don't have to say anything.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13.
How many of you are right? Excellent.
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Okay, now I'm going to out someone because I heard some laughter in the middle. Someone wasn't counting. And I know this because my mother doesn't listen to directions, and she went to an exercise like this, and she has a louder laugh than the person in the audience did, and she started guffawing in the middle. People are looking at her like, what's wrong with you, lady? She wasn't counting. But what you realize is...
Move in.
Okay, sorry about that. Don't know what that was. Stop. So what does all that have to do with race? It was amusing, it was interesting. We felt our automatic brain at work. We felt that automaticity, and we also experienced the phenomena of seeing what we're looking for. And we know that we can't look everywhere at once, and so if we're given a direction, either an explicit direction by a really cool English accent to count the passes that the team in white makes, or if we're given directions, frankly, by societal expectations and surroundings to expect certain things from certain people, that's what we see. And so the understanding of the unconscious mind can help us unlock this puzzle. What the unconscious mind does, it's not the unconscious of Freud. It's not, weird dreams that you're afraid to share with, your neighbors. The unconscious mind is actually the social collective mind where all the information that we absorb from our society is put into action. And what our mind does is it creates categories. It creates categories so we know when we walk into a room, we know where to sit. It creates categories so we know what to do when some small thing rings to pick it up. Because unlike when I was a child and there were phones that they were connected to the wall and they had little curly things and they were big, that's not what phones look like anymore. And we all know that. That's a new category. That's a new schema. So that's what our brain does. It fills in information that isn't present to allow us to make extrapolations. It's so powerful. And as John Powell, who gave the keynote last year, would say, it's lightning fast. Our conscious brain is really slow. And if we had to rely upon it all the time, we would essentially stand in one place and not move. It's too slow. So we have to rely on our unconscious mind. We also apply these categories. We also apply these categories, these schema, to people. And so children, as all the educators here know, very quickly realize who the principal is. And the principal is someone who you have to be very polite when they come into the room. And that's important. And we apply schema to know who needs more protection. So as a New Yorker, the example I often give is if I'm standing on a subway platform and a small person moves quickly toward the subway, it's actually like this, looks this way, but there's a third rail, and there's a subway car potentially coming down. If a small person goes like this, and I go and I pick up that small person and bring them back to safety, and it's a toddler, which is what I think, the category that I put that person in, I'm a hero. If it's a small person who is not a toddler, okay, I knew this was going to happen. If it's a small person who's literally a little person, of whom there are some in my school community, that's assault. So we need the categories. We need to know how to respond to people in their different uniforms, but we also know that the associations that we make... What should I do? The associations that we make with these categories can be laden with harms if those categories... I'm just going to stay over here. If those categories have content that do harm. So the example I give here is from the 19th century. And again, it's my group. So on the left, on my left, is the depiction of an Irish woman in the 19th century. She looks rather like an ape in that picture. The Irish were thought to be uneducable, savage, drunk. On the right was an English woman. She was lovely, she was dignified. Now, those are not categories or stereotypes that have power anymore. To be Irish is, it's nice, it's amusing. We had a president once, and it certainly doesn't create any obstacles to any opportunity I might have. But as we know, the stereotypes and associations of some other racial and ethnic groups have not changed. And sometimes people will say to me, or might be thinking, well, why can't other groups do what the Irish did? And the answer is, the Irish became white. That's not going to happen for other groups the way it did for the Irish. It's not going to happen. That doesn't mean that we can't challenge the stereotypes and change the way they filter into our brain and affect the way that we respond to people automatically, but it's not going to be the same trajectory as my group had. So why do we still have, if we've rejected racism, if we've rejected the idea of stereotypes, why do they still take hold? Why do they still affect our behavior? Because we continue, frankly, to be deluged by really distorted information. So this is a study by Travis Dixon at UCLA. And this is a study that has been replicated across every news source in the country and national news as well. The presentation of African American male violent crime so far exceeds the reality as to be kind of shocking by a factor of 20 to 30%. So the pictures that we have, the pictures people, particularly who live in communities where there are not a lot of African American men, so the only pictures they have are from the news shows or from the TV shows, and those pictures, particularly when it's news, so you think it's truth, you think it's real, those pictures seep into your brain and they affect who you think you should be afraid of. This is an interesting table, and it's probably one that you've seen before, where you have percentages of proportions of people who are poor. And the colors aren't great, but I'll tell you, so it's white, Black, Hispanic, other. Those are not my categories. I wouldn't have chosen those labels. But this is from Statistics About Michigan. Generally, when we hear poverty data, it's presented in the way that that table is. And so if I were to ask the question of most people, who do you think is the largest racial group of people in Michigan who are poor? Many people, arguably reasonably, will say, well, African Americans, Black people are the largest group of poor people. But the math, of course, is not just the picture of the graph. The math is the proportion of people according to the total population. And Michigan as a state is predominantly white. And so my numbers over there, white people, there's almost twice as many poor whites in Michigan as there are African Americans. Far more poor whites than Latinos, and far more whites than any other group. And yet, most of us don't know that. And so when we make assumptions about who our government programs are benefiting, for example, we assume, if we're white, that it's not people who look like us. And we assume that, and make certain assumptions then, about who it is that our tax dollars are benefiting that are inaccurate. And we also then make assumptions often about why it is that some groups aren't faring as well as others. And working through the distortions in information that were presented is part of unpacking the stereotypes. So there's another factoid that's often spread around by lots of people, including Barack Obama when he was running for president. So people often say things like, there are more Black men in prison than there are in college. That's totally wrong. It is true that there are far too many people, I think many of us now would agree, of every race and ethnicity who are in prison for low-level drug crimes. I think we've realized that's not a helpful way to deal with the phenomena. But the factoid suggesting that there are more Black men in prison than in college, that leads to another set of assumptions about Black men, and it's not true. Ivory Toldson kind of looked at the numbers more carefully, and his estimation 2 years ago was that there were 800,000 more young Black men in college than in prison. So what does that tell us? That gives us a very different picture of this group who are too often vilified. These are young men who are working hard, who are, again, doing their best to be part of the American story of education and of progress. And they're often rendered invisible. And those stories, turns out, those false depictions can lead people to be afraid and to respond to them in ways that affect them literally every day. Imagine if you walked by someone, and there's a slight cringe, a slight suggestion of fear. Every day. That's a lot of weight. That's a lot of burden. So this implicit bias that you've heard, how do we measure it? What does it look like? Well, the way that it has been measured most generally is on a website that you can actually look at called Project Implicit, housed at Harvard University. And what this website allows you to do is to see if you can as quickly associate positive words with faces from one group, perhaps Black faces or Asian American faces or elderly faces versus young faces, as you can with another group. And what the question of whether you can be as quick to say, sort of wonderful with a Black face as you can with a white face, if you can do that equally, that suggests that your unconscious mind is equally adept at seeing those positive qualities with one group as the other. Very few Americans who are white are able to as quickly associate positive words with Black faces as they are with white faces. And this time latency, it turns out, is powerful. Because as you've seen, as we've experienced together, our unconscious brains are powerful. Now, the IAT, as it's called, the implicit association test, is not a DNA test. It doesn't tell you something sort of intractable, never changing about you as a person. And it also doesn't completely dictate your behavior. Think back to our color test. Think back to the Stroop test. If we had moved really slowly, we could have nailed it completely. If I had slowed down when I got to the first schema inconsistent, the first time that the word read something different than the color of the text, if I had slowed down, as a group, we could have performed in unison together and stated the color of the text, even though it was different than the word. So we can overcome these implicit biases if we know they're a risk and if we're conscious of the need to slow down and to not necessarily just trust what we think are these trustworthy gut instincts that usually serve us very well. So another question you might be having is, well, does this implicit bias actually have any link to behavior? Or is, again, this just some sort of parlor trick? Implicit biases turn out to predict behavior more accurately than external self-reports. And this is how we can begin to, again, understand how people's conscious values, conscious rejection of racism, can nonetheless not be accompanied by the behavior that would suggest, because the unconscious mind dictates our behavior more accurately than our conscious values do, unless we begin the process of sort of taming those implicit biases. So here are a few examples. I'm going to start with the middle one because it's one that we may be all familiar with. So there was a study where resumes were sent out, exact same resumes, to hundreds of companies. Some of those resumes had Ben as the first name, Smith. Some of those identical resumes had Jamal as the first name. Ben had far more callbacks than Jamal, despite the identical qualifications on that resume. Now, I have a little individual anecdote that's slightly different but tells us something interesting. A student of mine, and he's given me permission to tell the story, a student of mine, Tyrone Blackburn, law student, sent out his resume with all of his accomplishments, and he was president of the Black Law Students Association. He sent out his resume, received very few callbacks. He then changed his resume to, instead of saying Tyrone A. Blackburn, to say T. Anthony Blackburn. He kept the fact that he was president of the Black Law Students Association on his resume. And he received many more callbacks than he had before. So it's not that the people who looked at the first version of the resume thought, oh no, we don't want to interview this guy to come be a lawyer for our firm because he's black. In fact, people were really enthusiastic when T. Anthony Blackburn walked into the office, and they absolutely knew he was black. He was president of the Black Law Students Association. But there was an implicit response to the name Tyrone that is akin to the implicit response to the name Jamal. It's the implicit that we have to be afraid of. Now, what we also know, and this is, again, one of these unbelievably shocking facts for judges to hear, that there is a link between skin color and Afrocentricity of features and harsher prison sentences and the likelihood of being sentenced to death. It's not a link between the box checked off and harsher sentences and likelihood of being sentenced to death. It's literally the physical color and features of the person. Jennifer Eberhardt did this research. She's recently won a MacArthur Genius Award. And judges are taking this very, very seriously. It's the implicit response to the person, not the fact of the box. Finally, and many of you have probably heard about this, there's the shooter bias studies. So there are studies, when some of you may have played sort of the video game that's akin to this, where your goal is to shoot the right person, right? You want to shoot whoever's armed, not whoever's carrying the cell phone or the wallet. There is a link, a direct link, between implicit bias levels and shooting unarmed black men and failing to shoot armed white men for most of us. But it's important to note, police officers are actually different from most of us. They are far more accurate, and they actually are not more likely, regardless of their implicit bias level, to shoot the unarmed black men. And this is going to be surprising to many. They are not more likely to shoot the unarmed black men, and they are successful in shooting the armed white men. But here's the difference. They shoot the black men faster. They're faster. And so when we think about some of the tragedies that we've seen, and I've actually talked to government officials who, when they hear that, they nod in a really sad way, and they think, when I look back at the shootings we've had in my county last year, 4 men were shot. 2 were white, 2 were black. Both of the white men, one had a gun out and had taken 2 shots before he was actually shot by the police. The other had a gun out, and the police actually managed to shoot the gun out of his hand. The 2 black men who were shot did not have guns out. They did not have guns out. There were guns in their pants pocket, but they weren't out. The police officers were faster. So it's a question of speed. Now, it means that we can get better. Training can make us better, but the implicit biases do come into play, as FBI Director Comey suggested, in law enforcement in obviously tragic ways. So here's another study that the law world is roiling. 60 partners at law firms were given memos, legal memos. This is what we do as young lawyers. We write legal memos. And they were fine. They were decent legal memos. Half of them thought it was a third-year associate named Tom Meyer, who went to New York University Law School, top 10 law school, who was white. Half of them thought Tom Meyer went to NYU Law School, who was black. You can see the comments, and the comments are provocative. White Tom Meyer is a generally good writer, but needs to work on X, Y, and Z. He's got potential, good analytic skills. And they picked out almost 2.9 of the 7 intentionally embedded spelling and grammatical errors. When we get to black Tom Meyer, he needs lots of work. Can't believe he went to NYU. Average at best. Now, those are 3 very provocative comments, and maybe they were cherry-picked. But when we look at the number of spelling and grammatical errors that the partners found when they thought the associate was black, we see something very different. We see literally an average of twice as many spelling and grammatical errors found when they thought the associate was black than when they thought the associate was white. Some of you may have heard the adage, if you're black, you've got to be twice as good. Twice as good. So this is the fear that many people of color reasonably have. I'm going to be judged more harshly. Small mistakes I make are going to matter when that same mistake made by somebody who doesn't share my race or ethnicity isn't going to be noticed. And it turns out, despite, I think we have every reason to believe that the partners of those law firms, had this memo been perfect, they would have been delighted. Excellent. We want a diverse firm. We want to have diverse attorneys. This is good for us for all sorts of reasons. So it's not that these folks are intentionally racist. It's really not. But when they saw that first spelling error, the implicit set of assumptions that still play a role in our society came into play. And when they saw those later spelling errors, first of all, like the passes, they were looking for them. They were looking for them. And when they saw them, they led to an extrapolation about capacity and talent that were obviously different when the same spelling errors were just glossed over when the associate was white. Another study, and this one, again, very distressing, but it has a ray of hope. Medical residents were given patient files of patients who had signs of heart disease. And the residents were able to correctly diagnose the heart disease, regardless of the race of the patient, and the patient had checked off the box like we all do typically in a form. But when it came to treatment, residents who had high implicit bias levels were significantly more likely to recommend the gold standard treatment, thrombolysis, to white patients than they were to black patients. Medical residents. Again, we know these folks aren't out there not to give good care. But here's the ray of hope. There was one group of medical residents who were told, not in a kind of hit you over the head way, this is a big race study way, but just in the long list of instructions for this diagnostic and treatment recommendation study, they were told race sometimes comes into play when people are making decisions. Again, it was very intentionally understated. But those residents who had an inkling of a reason to believe that race may play some role in their treatment recommendations, they self-corrected. They gave race-neutral, identical, gold standard treatment to everybody. So we can self-correct. We can make the adjustments we need to make. We just need to know to make them. So I've talked a fair amount, and you might be hearing more emphasis on the research having to do with African Americans than other groups. And it is not the case, as my first discussion very quickly of schools suggested, that other groups aren't also being affected by implicit biases. Assumptions about Latinos run rampant, and implicit biases, while not quite as high, absolutely affect a whole array of opportunities and a whole array of assumptions about capacity, about belonging, and these are obviously critical. What about Native Americans? Invisible, virtually invisible. Until 2011, there were no studies on implicit bias in Native Americans. And that invisibility itself can be a problem because when we think about the stereotypes and the associations, they come from way, way back. And so sometimes people wonder, why do people make it such a big deal out of like fights over mascots? I'm Irish, and I think the Fighting Irish at Notre Dame are cool. But again, the Irish are doing fine, no issues for us. So the Fighting Irish doesn't affect anyone's thinking about who we are as potential students or employees or whatever category you want to think about. But because there's so little known about modern day Native Americans, when the study was done using the Fighting Sioux, and then afterward a college student was asked, would you be willing to work with a Native American student as a partner on a project that's going to be graded, it had a significantly dampening effect. Those associations are still there. What about Asian Americans? There's all sorts of positive associations. They're really smart, they do really well in math, they're sort of analytic. As my friend Jerry Kong, whose picture there, would say, we play the violin. So there's all these positive associations. But even positive stereotypes can be limiting. So Jerry and some colleagues did a study called Are Litigators White, where they had jurors listen to the exact same deposition, which is a set of questions that are asked before a lawsuit. One group thought the person was Jerry Smith, the other group thought the person was named Sung Lim. Same male voice, same questions asked. They asked questions, do you think this lawyer is assertive? Do you think this lawyer is someone who could represent you well, could advocate on your interests, would be someone you'd recommend to a friend? Jerry Smith, not Jerry Kong, Jerry Smith did a lot better than Sung Lim, even though identical words were heard by people. There's a set of assumptions about Asian Americans that can limit opportunity if they're not challenged. With respect to Arab Americans and Muslims, I don't have anything up here about implicit bias. Now, if we were talking about some countries in Europe, there's been lots of studies. But what we know right now is that many more people are very, very comfortable expressing explicit hostility or concern about people they think are Muslim. And so right now our set of concerns about Arab Americans are as linked to the traditional sort of explicit bias as they are to implicit bias. And again, Michigan, like Brooklyn, where I come from, is a state with a very large Arab American Muslim population, and embracing that population and ensuring that that population doesn't feel the explicit hostility and the explicit assumptions and stereotypes is critically important, obviously, to the future of the state. Okay, I'm going to move past a couple of my examples, even though they're fun, because I've got some other really important concepts to get to. So is implicit bias only something that is cognitive and evaluative? Well, no. Implicit bias is also something that can be shown and is shown in our body language. How close do we stand to someone? How much eye contact do we use? How long is our meeting? And so people can actually watch an interaction between someone with high implicit bias and the person of the race against whom they have the bias and figure out who's got the bias. Because they stand like this, they're far away, their answers are short, and the interview, if that's what we're talking about, ends quickly. So implicit bias is behavioral and relational as well as cognitive. And again, think about teachers, think about employers, think about doctors, think about judges. What does it mean if your doctor doesn't have eye contact with you, stands far away, and then is asking you sensitive questions about your health. Do you answer them as readily? Do you trust the doctor so much? No. So this has implications in virtually every life domain we care about. So the idea might be, well, let's just quit talking about race, let's be colorblind, and we'll be done with it all. But what this body of research tells us is, even though for most people our explicit values would suggest that we're done, that we're post-racial, we're not yet done. And that doesn't mean that we're all racist. It means we all have work to do collectively. And there's a link between our structures and with whom we live, work, and play, and how powerful the media stereotypes and the images from the outside are in how we interact with people. If you've got lots of neighbors who are all sorts of different races and ethnicities, you're going to have individual reasons to know that the stereotypes aren't right. But if you don't, it doesn't make you a bad person that your neighborhood hasn't yet become integrated, but it means you've got work to do. Because you've got more challenges, because the only information you're getting is outside information. And so seeking out opportunities to interact with people is going to be really important, along with some other ideas. So what can be done? Well, it turns out we actually can reduce our levels of implicit bias. We can actually reduce bias. But knowing how difficult that's going to be and that it's going to take a while, and knowing what's critical, most critical, is that our behavior, our decisions, not reflect those biases that we consciously reject. We can also engage in what we call bias override. We can put sort of guarantees in place, checklists in place to protect us against having these implicit biases play a role. Very quickly, and there's so much more to say about all of this, Trish Devine at the University of Wisconsin, go Badgers, did a wonderful study where she came up with her counterparts multiple steps that, if taken together and engaged in over a period of weeks, literally reduced bias. So the crux of reducing bias is to change the stereotypes and the myths and the hardened assumptions about people and replace them with a much broader, more open set of views of who someone can be. But what's also key are two things. One is, and this can be really hard if you're white, to learn to both individuate, and when you see someone who's of another race, be able to see differences, but also to be able to continue to think of them as fitting into that racial group. What do I mean? Well, we'll often hear someone say, well, if you're white, you've got a black friend, I don't think of you as black. And the white person is shocked when the black person looks at them and says, excuse me? And perhaps doesn't think that friendship is as solid as they once thought. It's not that being, sort of non-racist means not noticing if someone's black, in the same way that sort of if someone says, I don't think of you as a woman, I'm not necessarily flattered. Now, that doesn't mean that my being is reduced to my gender, but that means that part of who I am is a woman and a mother and all the things that go along with that, but I'm also a full person. Race is the same way. We have to be able to recognize someone self-identifies and is proud of their race or their ethnicity or their religion. That's part of who they are, and that's to be celebrated, not, don't worry, I don't think of you as one of them. That's what that sentence suggests. But again, as a white person who's told you should be colorblind, you don't quite know how to do this. And so you don't know how to look at someone and see their full personhood that includes their race or their ethnicity and not be afraid that that's actually being racist. And we also have to be able to engage in what we call empathic perspective taking. Now, we'll often hear people say, I can stand in someone else's shoes, and if I were standing in someone else's shoes and a police officer told me to get out of the middle of the road, I would just do it. What's the problem? That's not quite perspective taking. That's what would my experience be given my lifetime of being treated really, really well by police officers. They help me all the time. But if my life experience had been completely different and I'd been had assumptions made about me all the time, that sentence said to me would feel very different. being a mother of a child and being worried about police instead of, like me, being a mother of a child and being delighted when there are police, it's a very different experience. So, empathic perspective taking. The outcomes are fabulous. Implicit bias is reduced, and people are actually excited to engage in interracial interactions. They're excited, and this is in Madison, Wisconsin, which has lots of the same challenges as many of the communities in Michigan. But I also want to end, and I know I probably have like 8 minutes left. I've got someone telling me. I also want to talk as quickly as I can about the potential unintended rebound effects of just suddenly being like, okay, I know it, I accept it, I've got bias. And suddenly becoming, if you're white, terrified that you're going to say something wrong. Because that's a really common phenomena for people like me who've been thinking about race for a long time to be racially anxious. And I'm going to talk about stereotype threat a little bit too, but I want to start with racial anxiety. So for many people of color, and this makes eminent sense, there's anxiety before and during an interracial interaction that you are going to be subject to bias. You're going to be subject to discrimination. And that obviously makes sense. Many whites, without being aware of it, are also really anxious that we're going to say something stupid that's going to suggest to the person we're talking to that we're racist. And if both people in the interaction are anxious, guess what? It doesn't go very well. Both people, again, you sit further away, you're less open, your eye contact is lower because you're anxious. And it turns out that the effects of racial anxiety look a lot like the behavioral effects of bias. So the teacher who really wants to be a wonderful teacher to kids of all races and who suddenly has been told she has implicit bias, and she goes into the classroom and she's looking around at her kids and she's suddenly thinking, oh my gosh, I've got implicit bias, it's a natural, fairly typical reaction for her to get a little avoidant of the black mom when she comes to pick up her black son because she's afraid, oh my gosh, I have bias, she's going to know it, she's going to think I'm a racist. And most whites think being a racist is more immoral than being a drunk driver and second only to being a pedophile. So we really do worry about this, but it can't be about our worry, right? This isn't about us. This is about our behavior. This is about the way we engage. This is about how we become the people we want to be. And just getting super anxious does not do the work. In fact, our brains shut down. My favorite example of this, and she's given me permission too, is a friend who grew up in Heartland, Wisconsin, which is a very homogenous town. They knew the Catholic family, they knew the Jewish family. Everyone else shared a religious tradition. Most had blonde hair. When she got to Michigan Law School, she was really worried and excited to have lots of different friends, but she was worried too because she didn't want to say the wrong thing. So with our Jewish friends, on the way to lunch, she talked about ham incessantly. There were 2 Latino guys, I'm embarrassed to say, only 2 in our law school class, Pedro and Juan. Pedro was about 5'8", very light-skinned. Juan was 6'1", very dark-skinned. They could not have looked any more different. She could not get their names straight to save her life, and I'm talking 2 people. And this is a woman whose heart was as big as this auditorium. And eventually she got over the racial anxiety, but it shut her brain down. It's like when people say, don't think of an elephant, all you could think about was an elephant. So the racial anxiety piece of this is actually really important. There are interventions here too, and I'm not going to have time to go through all of them because I have to dive into stereotype threat really quickly before the anchor comes off and I'm shut down. But there are interventions to this too, and there's ways that, again, we can jump over this step and not make those mistakes. All right, what's the stereotype threat I've been talking about? It's been likened to running into a headwind when everyone else has the wind at their back. If you're worried about confirming a negative stereotype about your group, it literally pushes you back. And here's an example from gender. We all know there's sort of stereotypes about women in math. And if Stanford math majors, women and men, are told that, yes, in fact, women are not as strong at math as men, you can see from the green on the left how the women perform, not so well. You can also see the men get a little stereotype lift there. Oh, we're pretty good at this. If that is discounted, on this test, women and men do virtually the same, we can see the women's performance goes up considerably. The men's actually goes down a little bit, so they've kind of lost that lift. Obviously, our ideal is to figure out a way to lift both, but it's a really powerful phenomenon. This is a graph from the first study done in 1995 by Claude Steele, and it shows for African American, again, Stanford grad students in the humanities, brilliant students, he's wondering, why aren't more going to grad school? And they say, well, the GRE. Well, why would the GRE be difficult for these brilliant students? Because the GRE, the Graduate Record Examination, is one of those tests that requires every ounce of your cognitive capacity. And if a little part of your brain is sort of infused by this unknown concern that you're going to confirm the negative stereotype that your group isn't as smart, that doesn't allow you to be your best self. It doesn't allow you to perform to your capacity. And so we see the difference for the group who's told this is a difficult part of the GRE that confirms whether or not you're going to go to grad school and whether or not you're really intellectually smart as you think. It really affects the outcomes, because we see what happens when students are told this isn't about how you perform, this is how you feel when you perform, and take it seriously so the study goes well. We see how the gap changes. And this has been replicated in 300 studies. Now this is interesting. This is a more recent test. Turns out every group can be susceptible to stereotype threat. When white math majors are just male math majors, because we want to just keep it to men for a second, test of your math ability, do pretty well, right? When they're testing their math ability and they're told this is relative to Asian Americans, not quite as well. So this is something that we can all experience, but of course it's experienced much more significantly and readily by those of us who are the non-dominant people in a particular area. So for women in the math and sciences, for people of color in certain areas, it has a more profound effect. For people of color particularly, and for girls in math, these begin in grade school. And there are phenomenal interventions that we can talk about. But what I want to end with is something that a colleague of mine, Phil Atiba-Goff, calls white stereotype threat. And this is like racial anxiety, but it's a little bit different. This is the fear of confirming the stereotype that you're racist, and let's see what happens with the police. So Phil Goff works with police departments all over the country, and his studies have to do with what are the phenomena that lead to the excessive stops and the excessive uses of force. Now, with respect to the excessive stops, he found, not wildly surprisingly, that the explicitly biased police officers, and he's African American, so when he walks in and a police officer says, this is ridiculous, we all know that more black men are criminals, why are we doing this study? This is a person who's explicitly biased and feels totally comfortable saying it. But Phil says, have a donut, do the study, and they end up working together anyway. And he literally gives that quote, it's not mine. So again, not wildly surprisingly, the explicitly biased police officer stops black men at a disproportionately high rate. Interestingly, implicit bias doesn't do a lot of work for us here. Phil was also interested to see whether, and there actually are two other phenomena that he's interested in, whether the concern about being seen as racist and masculinity anxiety were in any way relevant. Well, when we get to force, when we get to which police officers are most likely to engage in excessive force, meaning, force that leads people to the hospital, force that leads to serious contusions, this is interesting. This is our explicitly biased police officer. Not so much force, low and high are a little low down there, but high is on my far left. Not so interesting. Implicit bias, perhaps surprisingly, also doesn't have a lot of a role to play in explicit use of force. But look at stereotype threat. So this is the police officer who is worried about being perceived as racist. Shockingly, he's more likely to put someone in the hospital than the guy who's straight out saying, I think, black guys are more likely to commit crimes than white guys. How could that possibly be? Phil's explanation is that police officers have two sources of moral authority. Two sources of authority, moral and physical. If you're worried that someone thinks of you as a racist, if you're worried that you're going to be perceived as a racist, that takes away your moral authority. That takes away your ability to conduct yourself and hold yourself in a way that diffuses the situation. And so what do you have left? Your physical authority. And so Phil, where he'd be giving this keynote, and I'd recommend him, he shows a slide of the most explicitly biased police officer and the most concerned about being seen as racist. And in the first slide he shows, and he calls him Cuddles. He's a really big guy, very kind of swaggers in, and the exercise is to have a recalcitrant person on the street, and how do you respond to that person? And in this exercise, it's an African-American man, a young man, wearing a hat, holding a stick, and yelling horrible epithets that I won't repeat to the police officer. And the explicitly biased, very confident in his masculinity police officer kind of stands there calmly, put the stick down, not impressed. Let's make this easy. You're coming in. You can't go after police officers with sticks and think it's going to end well. Let's end this now. Totally calm. The exercise ends. The most concerned about race issues guy who Phil bonded with when it all started, in the same exercise, it's shown, he calls him Bang Bang, he's shown like this, shaking and screaming, put the stick down, again, epithets. And the exercise ends with him shooting the gentleman with the stick. And this would be considered a good shoot, because this guy had a stick and he was going after a police officer with a shoot. But it didn't have to end that way. It didn't have to end that way. Now, Phil wouldn't say, let's get rid of everybody who cares about race issues on the police force. That's obviously not the answer. But it's also not the answer to say, let's test everybody for implicit bias and get rid of all of them. The answer is, and this is the work Phil's done, is to help the police officers who are worried about being seen as racist understand what it means to be a non-racist cop. And he gives them a 4-step protocol. And again, it helps to have leadership that's multiracial, and Phil, as an African-American man, can help validate this. If you know the reason you're stopping someone and can state it respectfully and firmly to the person, if you use as little physical force as possible, if you use respectful language, if you do all of those things, you are not racist. You can have full confidence in your moral authority, and it doesn't matter what the guy in the moment says. Who knows what his experiences have been. This is about whether you are exercising your authority in a non-racist way, and you are. And it works. We can teach people how to reduce stereotype threat as girls taking math tests. We can alter dynamics for students of color taking the GRE, and we can help police officers and anyone else in a position of power not have their moral authority diminished and their ability to handle a situation calmly and well undermined by their very good intentions not to be racist. But what we have to realize is this can't be about our concerns about ourselves if we're white. All this work is for us to be able to behave in ways that allow partnership and to work together, and ultimately, and this is a quick example of the same phenomena that I just described in the school context, and it's equally toxic if we're not giving critical feedback. But ultimately, and this is why, I can't go on all this, but I'll share it. Ultimately, and I'm going to end with this because I know it's time, I see the rope coming. Ultimately, what's amazing is communities, full communities, can engage in openness and inclusivity and celebration of difference and progress and moving forward together. And this, finally, is 2 communities in Pennsylvania, Hazleton, which many of you have heard of, which is a place that enacted one of the most hostile ordinances challenging the presence of immigrants, and Easton. Now, these are demographically identical communities, and Hazleton is known nationwide for making it illegal to rent an apartment to someone who doesn't have proof of citizenship, and that seen as and sort of affecting most people who appear Latino. And Easton, which has celebrations of their multi-ethnic community. What's the difference? The difference is that the leadership in Easton reached a hand out to community leaders who were moving into Easton from the Latino community, and civic society flourished. and became inclusive of all the members of that community. Easton's doing better economically, children are doing better in the Easton schools, and the community can celebrate everyone who's there. So I am so grateful for your patient attention. I'm sorry I went over, and I hope all of you can move forward together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was such a powerful way to open our day together. I'm really thinking about the holding on to our moral code, because I think that that's something that we are really hungry for as a nation, and learning about some of the pitfalls along the way, but also the hope that there are things that we can do to control it and really place those values at the center and work together for a better future is really exciting. So thank you, Rachel, so much for your inspiring words. I believe we are going to...
Thank you for inviting me to be part of the 2015 summit.
We are going to hear a few words from Governor Snyder before we move to our breakouts.